I think is a great thing. And this Formula E series, I think, is a great showcase for.
Princess Charlene did not become the center of a royal crisis because of one explosive confession, one leaked recording, or one courtroom scandal. She became the center of it because she seemed to disappear in slow motion. In the year 2021, she spent months away from Monaco in South Africa, officially because of a serious ear, nose, and throat infection. Then came the hospital stay. Then came reports that she had collapsed. Then came the return everyone thought would end the questions. And instead, the questions only grew louder. Why did a princess stay away for so long? Why did Monaco sound increasingly defensive each time it spoke? Why did her return feel less like closure and more like the beginning of something even darker? And why did a marriage that the palace kept defending begin to look more fragile with every new reassurance? Because this was the real shock at the heart of the story. Charlene came back to Monaco, but only briefly. Days later, the palace announced that she would step away again, recover in a secret location, and withdraw from public duties because of what it called a state of profound general fatigue. That phrase changed everything. It sounded careful, official, almost clinical. But to the public, it sounded like a palace trying to hold the walls together while the world stared at the cracks. So let us reopen the whole story from the beginning and ask what was really happening inside Monaco when the princess vanished from view. Before the rumors, before the medical bulletins, and before Monaco began sounding as if it were trying to calm a fire no one could fully see, Prince Albert II and Princess Charlene were presented as something close to a royal correction. Albert was not just any European prince. He was the son of Prince Rainier III and Princess Grace, born into one of the most photographed dynasties in the world, and he formally succeeded his father in the year 2005. Charlene, by contrast, came from a very different world. Born Charlene Wittstock, she was shaped not by palaces, but by elite sport. The palace biography notes that she moved to South Africa as a child, rose through competitive swimming, competed at the Sydney Olympic Games in the year 2000, and met Prince Albert that same year during a swimming competition in Monaco. That contrast was a huge part of the appeal. He represented lineage, ceremony, and continuity. She represented discipline, athleticism, and an outsider's freshness. On screen and in photographs, it looked like a perfect modern royal formula, old-world glamour balanced by real-world grit. Their engagement was announced in June 2010, and the palace later confirmed that the civil and religious wedding ceremonies took place on the 1st and 2nd of July in the year 2011. On paper, it was everything a monarchy like Monaco could have wanted. A sovereign prince, long associated with bachelorhood, was finally marrying. A former Olympian was becoming a princess. The image practically built itself. But this is where the first fault line matters. The relationship was never just a private love story. It arrived with institutional pressure attached to it. Reuters wrote at the time of the engagement that Albert had acknowledged fathering 2 children outside marriage, and that the engagement seemed to mark the end of decades in which he had been seen as one of Europe's most eligible bachelors. That meant Charlene was entering not only a marriage, but a role in a repair project. Whether anyone said it aloud or not, the union was expected to help steady the image of the principality and soften Albert's older playboy reputation. That is a dangerous burden for any relationship to carry, because once a marriage becomes symbolic, every silence inside it begins to matter more than it should. And for a while, the symbolism worked. The wedding gave Monaco a new fairy tale, and the birth of twins, Jacques and Gabriella, in December 2014 gave that fairy tale the final seal of continuity. From the outside, the picture looked complete: prince, princess, heirs, palace, legacy. But that is often how fragile stories look just before the strain begins to show. Because what the public saw was stability. What it did not yet see was how much weight had been placed on that image from the very beginning. The scandal did not begin with a confession, it began with time. In the year 2021, Princess Charlene travelled to South Africa for what should have been a temporary stay connected to her conservation and charitable commitments. But instead of returning quickly to Monaco, she remained there for months. The official explanation was medical. Reuters reported in early September that she had left hospital in South Africa after treatment for an ear, nose, and throat infection, and that the palace had said she had fainted because of complications from that condition. That detail changed the tone of the story at once. Until then, an absence could still be read as inconvenience, scheduling, or private choice. After the hospital report, it became something heavier. A princess was not simply away. She was unwell, far from Monaco, and suddenly the separation had both a medical and an emotional weight the palace could not easily control. And yet illness alone was not what turned this into a YouTube-level scandal. The real escalation came from how long the absence lasted and how exposed the marriage became while she was away. Reuters later reported that Charlene had spent most of that year in South Africa before finally returning to Monaco in November. In royal life, long absences are never neutral. They create a vacuum, and a vacuum invites interpretation. Each missed event, each family moment carried out without her, made the public feel less as though they were watching a temporary health setback, and more as though they were watching a marriage being stress-tested in real time. The palace could explain the infection. It could explain the treatment. What it could not easily explain was the atmosphere growing around the couple. Because once the public starts measuring distance emotionally rather than medically, every month apart begins to look like evidence of something larger. That is why her return in November should have ended the crisis, but did the opposite. Reuters reported that Monaco welcomed Charlene back after her months-long absence, creating the image everyone had been waiting for. The princess home, the family restored, the possibility that the story had been exaggerated all along. But the relief lasted only a moment. Within days, the palace announced that Charlene would suspend public duties and recover in a secret location because she was suffering from what it called a state of profound general fatigue. Reuters also noted that her long stay in South Africa had already fueled speculation over a marital rift. This was the turning point that made the story genuinely gripping. The public had been told she was finally back, yet almost immediately they were told she was gone again from public life. Monaco was trying to close the narrative, but instead it widened it. The official language was calm, controlled, and clinical. The emotional effect was the exact opposite. From there, the scandal took on the shape of a palace mystery rather than a conventional royal embarrassment. Reuters reported that during Monaco's national holiday in November, Albert appeared with the children while Charlene remained absent, and the children held up messages saying they missed their mother. Visually, it was devastating. There was no screaming headline needed because the image itself did the work. A prince on the balcony, 2 young children beside him, and a mother missing from one of the principality's most symbolic public moments. In ordinary life, a family coping with illness might disappear into privacy. In royal life, those painful absences become public theatre, and that is what made this phase so powerful. There was no final proof of marital collapse, no legal filing, no official separation, but there was a procession of images and statements that made the marriage feel increasingly fragile, even while the institution insisted on stability. Then came the next stage, not explosion, but erosion. In March of the year 2022, Reuters reported that Charlene had returned to Monaco as her recovery continued, with the palace saying that the coming weeks should help her regain strength before gradually resuming official duties. On paper, this sounded like resolution. In practice, it sounded more like a careful effort to rebuild normality after a season in which normality had completely broken down. The difficulty was that by now the story no longer belonged only to official facts. It also belonged to memory. People remembered the months in South Africa. They remembered the hospital report. They remembered the secret recovery location. They remembered how often the palace had to reassure the public. So even when recovery was real, suspicion survived. That is one of the cruel rules of modern scandal. Once a narrative of instability takes hold, recovery itself can be read as part of the cover story. The final layer of the scandal came later, when the palace was still being forced to deny rumors that the marriage was breaking apart. Publicly, Monaco held the line. The couple remained together in the official story. The palace continued to reject separation speculation, but by that stage, the deeper damage had already been done. This was no longer simply a story about whether a rumor was true or false. It had become a story about confidence. Could the public still believe what it was being shown? Could a royal institution built on composure still persuade the world that all was well once people had watched months of visible strain unfold? That is why the Albert and Charlene scandal became so potent. It was built from confirmed illness, confirmed absence, confirmed exhaustion, and a marriage that was defended so often it started to feel permanently on trial. And in scandals like that, the absence of a final verdict does not weaken the drama, it makes it linger. What made the Albert and Charlene story so powerful was not that the public was handed one devastating revelation, it was the opposite. The case grew because people were never given a single clear moment to process, only a chain of unsettling facts that seemed to point in different directions at once. Charlene was genuinely ill. Reuters reported that she was treated in South Africa for an ear, nose, and throat infection, and that the condition led to her collapse. She later returned to Monaco, but the palace then said she needed more time to recover from what it called a state of profound general fatigue. Those facts were real and serious, but the emotional effect they created was not clarity, it was uncertainty. And uncertainty, especially around royalty, often travels further than a confirmed scandal because it forces the audience to fill in the empty spaces for themselves. That is the first reason this story hit so hard. It was a scandal made out of absence. In most celebrity collapses, the public gets something concrete to hold on to: an accusation, a leaked message, a legal filing, a public breakup. Here, the main visual was simply that the princess was not there. She was missing from Monaco for months. Then she came back. Then, almost immediately, she was gone again from public duties. From a media perspective, that is incredibly potent because it turns even ordinary palace images into emotional evidence. A balcony appearance without her, a carefully worded bulletin, a husband answering questions while trying to sound calm. None of those things prove a broken marriage. But together they created a mood that was stronger than proof. And once a scandal becomes a mood, it is much harder for institutions to defeat it. The second reason is Prince Albert himself. Long before Charlene's health crisis became a public drama, Albert already carried a complicated media image. Reuters noted at the time of his engagement that he had acknowledged fathering 2 children outside marriage and had spent years cast as one of Europe's most eligible bachelors. That background matters because it shaped the way audiences interpreted everything that came later. Fair or unfair, a public figure does not enter a crisis with a blank slate. He enters it with accumulated mythology. So when Charlene's absence stretched on and palace denials became more frequent, many people were already predisposed to suspect that the story might be bigger than illness alone. That does not make those suspicions true, but it helps explain why they spread so fast and why Monaco's reassurances never fully settled the atmosphere around the couple. The third reason lies with Charlene's own public persona. The palace biography presents her as an Olympian, a disciplined athlete, a mother of twins, and the figure behind a foundation focused on drowning prevention and the values of sport. That official portrait is serious, restrained, and highly controlled. It gives the public a princess associated with poise, rather than oversharing. Under normal conditions, that reserve can be an asset. In a crisis, it can become a vacuum. Because when a public figure is naturally private, audiences often project more onto silence than they would onto words. Charlene's distance, sadness, and physical fragility became part of the mythology of the story precisely because she never seemed to offer the kind of emotional access modern audiences expect. In effect, the less she explained publicly, the more symbolic she became. She stopped being just a woman recovering from illness and became, in the public imagination, the face of a royal mystery. That transformation was not declared by the palace. It was produced by the tension between its official biography of stability and the visual narrative of exhaustion and retreat that the world had just watched unfold. Then there is the media war itself. By March of 2023, people reported that palace sources were calling reports of a split totally unfounded and malicious. On one level, that was the institution fighting back. On another, it showed how long the damage had lasted. Because by that point, the palace was no longer trying only to protect a couple. It was trying to protect credibility. Once an institution has to deny the same kind of story over and over, the denial can begin to sound less like closure and more like part of the ongoing narrative. That is one of the strangest rules of modern celebrity culture. Repeated reassurance can become dramatic material in its own right. It tells the audience not that the story is over, but that the battle over the story is still active. And in a digital media environment built on interpretation, that keeps attention alive far longer than a neat resolution would. So who won the public battle? Formally, Monaco did. The official story survived. The marriage was never publicly dissolved. The palace never conceded the darker narrative. But emotionally, the rumors won something important. They permanently changed how many people see Albert and Charlene. The couple may still stand together in official photographs, but the image is no longer innocent. It now carries memory of the months away, of the medical bulletins, of the deep fatigue, of the children holding messages for their absent mother, and of a principality that kept insisting everything was under control, while the world felt the opposite. That is why this case lasted. Not because it proved everything, but because it proved just enough to make doubt feel reasonable. And once doubt settles into a royal marriage, it can outlive every statement meant to erase it. In the end, the Albert and Charlene story did not conclude with the kind of clean public ending that tabloids prefer. There was no court ruling that explained everything, no formal confession that settled the mood once and for all. Instead, the aftermath was defined by recovery, denial, and a damaged sense of trust. Reuters reported in March of the year 2022 that Charlene had returned to Monaco as her health improved, while the palace said the following weeks should help her regain strength before a gradual return to duties. Even after the worst phase had passed, the official response still sounded cautious, as if the institution knew that restoring routine would not automatically restore belief. That is the first lesson this story leaves behind. In royal life, image can survive a crisis, but innocence rarely does. Officially, the family structure remained intact. The palace biography continues to frame Charlene as Prince Albert's wife, the mother of Jacques and Gabriella, and the figure behind her foundation work, while the palace's own announcements recorded the twins' birth in December of the year 2014. Even well after the darkest period, the palace continued to present Albert, Charlene, and their children together in official settings, including a public family visit in July of the year 2025. Institutionally, that is continuity. Emotionally, however, the public memory is different. People do not mainly remember the biography. They remember the absence. They remember the fatigue. They remember how often the palace had to insist that the marriage was not collapsing. And that is where the second lesson becomes more uncomfortable. By March of the year 2023, palace sources were still pushing back against separation rumors, calling one report totally unfounded and malicious. The formal battle, in other words, was no longer about health alone. It was about narrative control. Once the public starts to believe that a royal household may be managing appearances more carefully than emotions, every denial risks sounding like another chapter in the story rather than the end of it. The marriage may have survived as an official fact, but it also became permanently shadowed by a question the palace could never fully silence. So perhaps the deepest legacy of this scandal is not that it proved one dramatic secret. It is that it exposed how modern audiences now consume uncertainty itself. A woman may be genuinely ill. A family may be genuinely trying to recover. Yet once pain becomes public and explanation becomes repetitive, the world begins to treat suffering as suspense. That is what makes the Albert and Charlene story feel so haunting even now. It is not only a royal scandal. It is a reminder that when famous people fall into crisis, the public often stops asking what they need and starts asking what else might be hidden. And sometimes, that is the most revealing scandal of all.